Hello, welcome to our first class of our training module for the CompTIA Cybersecurity Analyst exam. So the focus of this course will be on analyzing techniques, concepts, how to use tools and technologies in order to, first of all, be able to protect a network, understand how a cybersecurity analyst is supposed to think, how he is or she is supposed to act, the tools that can be used in its favor, and also the techniques that are used by attackers. Now, it is also obviously very important to understand all those things in order to take the CompTIA CYSA Plus exam. So the main goal of this training course is to prepare you for the CompTIA CYSA Plus exam. And it's important to highlight that because as we move forward, we're going to be talking about some concepts that you should know for that specific exam. Okay, so with no further ado, let's get started. And our first topic is going to be on concepts. So we're going to introduce or revise, obviously it depends on your expertise, on your knowledge, but we're going to revise or introduce some concepts, basic concepts that are important for a cybersecurity analyst. And the very first one is the difference between security and privacy. There is a huge confusion that usually people make when mentioning these concepts. You hear many people using these two terminologies as if they're interchangeable, which is not the case. So let's just remember that security we can summarize that security is much more related to the technical implementation, the technical skill set that you have in order to protect information, to protect data. So security is related to the CIA triad. So that stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality, and so the goal of each of these ones is to protect against disclosure or at least excessive disclosure. Integrity is focusing on protecting from alteration, tampering data. And availability wants to prevent services from being denied. So confidentiality is a concept that wants to guarantee that only those that are supposed to access the data, access that information, is actually going to access that specific information. So third parties that are not supposed to access that won't. Integrity focuses on guaranteeing that the information that is stored or transmitted, the data that is being stored or transmitted, will not be altered, will not be tampered. And availability tries to guarantee that information will always be available. So, obviously that is the focus. It may not happen with 100% of availability, but that is the ultimate goal. So the idea is to prevent from denial of services, for example, or any type of denial to that data or to that information. Now, privacy, on the other hand, is focusing on how to manage someone else's data, someone else's information. So, for example, you may have seen situations where you visit a website and that website is warning you that the information that is being retrieved or asked for you will be maintained somehow, will not be distributed. or if it is going to be distributed, how it's supposed to be distributed. That information will always be available for you as well. So there is a bunch of information there saying, hey, so this is what we are going to do with your information, because that's your privacy, and we want to guarantee that you have that your information is private. So a bunch of rules that will be put in place to guarantee that your privacy is being kept. And that information is called, it's identified, you're going to see that many times in the CompTIA CYSA Plus exam, PII. They're not going to use personally identifiable information. The entire time that you're going to see in the exam, it will display PII. So you're supposed to know that stands for personally identifiable information, which is a private information or private data. So someone else's private data. And the thing about personally identifiable information is that it is regulated by law or principle. So the reason why I put it here between quotes is because, well, you can't regulate principles, right? But there is some ethical concerns involved in how the information is being kept, how the information is being shared, how the information is being collected. So in many situations, there are regulations, issues that are regulated by law. For example, we have HIPAA, which is supposed to guarantee or regulate how some type of information, health informatics, health data is being kept and distributed. So there is a regulation there. Same thing, so if it's credit card transactions, if it involves credit card transactions, then we have the DSS regulation as well. Now, there are some situations where these can't be regulated. So, but we do have some ethical aspects involved. So that's why I mentioned this as regulated principles. And because of that, 10 generally accepted privacy principles, GAPP. Also, when you see it in the CompTIA CYSA Plus exam, it won't mention generally accepted privacy principles. It's just going to mention GAPP. Okay, so we have generally 10 GAPP practices. And what are these practices? This is what is expected, or these are principles that are expected by organizations when they are dealing with other people's data. So let's take a look at those 10 practices. First one, we have management. So the first practice that is expected from a company that is dealing with other people's data is to manage the data, the privacy of the data. And what does it mean to manage that privacy? That means that they have to document their privacy. So they have to document how they're taking care of other people's data. They must also notice users. So let users know that they are dealing with those users' data and how they're dealing with that. Obviously, there is a choice and consent. So users must know that company is collecting data, maybe they're storing that data, and even if they're going to share that data, there must be a choice and consent form, for example. So somehow the users must be aware of that. Also, how they are collecting that data. They are collecting that data and how they are collecting that data. So this is pretty much related to choice and consent. So first, the user must be made aware of that before they can actually collect the data. They must also document the usage, retention, and disposal of that information. So the user must be aware that, okay, so your information is being kept, we're going to use it. If possible, the user must know how that information is going to be used, how that information is going to be retained, and how that information is going to be disposed, and even when that information is going to be disposed. Another practice is access. So the user must be able to access his own or her own information. So if I visit a website that is going to collect data, if at any moment I want to know what type of data they are collecting or what they actually collected, I have the right to know that that specific information. The disclosure practice says that if that company, that organization that is collecting data, collecting the user's data, is at any point going to disclose that information to another organization, that must be also made available. The user must also be aware that may happen at any specific point. So it brings back to choice and consent, but this is choice and consent of disclosing data to other organizations. And security, obviously, the techniques that are going to be put in place in order to guarantee that that private information is not going to be accessed by someone else, by another company, for example. Also, the accuracy of the data. So it is a good practice for an organization to guarantee that the information that is being stored, the data that is being stored, is going to be accurate. It's not going to be changed. It's not going to be altered. And obviously, there must be a constant review of these other 9 practices. So the company, the organization, must be constantly monitoring how they're, for example, how they're securing the information that they have, how they're guaranteeing that the information, that the data there is accurate, that the users are in accordance with the way that the information is being kept. So it guarantees it monitors the other 9 practices. Now, even with those good practices that are expected from organizations, obviously, risks may exist. And one of the key characteristics of a cybersecurity analyst is to be able to perform risk assessment. That is critical. And what is risk assessment? Basically, the idea is to be able to assess risks, be able to identify type of risks. But first, we have to understand what a risk actually is. What does it mean? What does the keyword risk actually mean? So first, we have to analyze 2 concepts: vulnerability and threat. And they are not the same. Well, and in many situations, you as a cybersecurity analyst is going to first analyze threat, then vulnerability, although there is no requirement here. There is no clear sequence. So, first of all, vulnerability. Vulnerability is identifying that a system, for example, or a device, or an infrastructure or premises are vulnerable to a specific attack. Now, keep in mind, an attack can be on purpose or not. But it just means that the vulnerability exists. The vulnerability is there. It's very specific. For example, you may have an operating system that is vulnerable to a type of attack. Now, a threat is associated with the possibility of that attack actually taking place. So if you have a vulnerable system, a system that is vulnerable to a specific type of attack, does that mean that system is going to be attacked? No, it doesn't. So it depends on the threat. And the opposite is also true. You may have an environment that is susceptible to a threat, but the vulnerability is not there. So for example, one type of threat that we're going to talk about is the environmental threat. For example, some locations in the United States are susceptible to hurricane hits. Well, that is a threat. But even if that happens, even if hurricanes occur in that specific area where the organization is situated, is located, does it mean that a specific vulnerability will be exploited? Well, maybe there is no relation between those two. For example, an operating system that is vulnerable to some kind of shell coding, how is that related to an environmental threat? There is no relation there. There is no correlation. So these two are not correlated. Obviously, there is another vulnerability that would be that would exist there because of that threat. So there must be a correlation between the vulnerability and that threat. With that in mind, then you can calculate the risk. You can determine the risk. So a risk is the consideration of threat times vulnerability. Now, so far, there is no numbers involved here. There are no numbers involved here. So we can't actually make this, you cannot analyze it as a mathematical formula, although there are models that will give points to specific threats and specific vulnerabilities, and we're actually going to talk that in the future. But these are different models, different methodologies. So far, what we're analyzing is just the concept of risk assessment. And as far as risk assessment goes, risk is simply the combination of a threat and a vulnerability. Now, in order to make this more identifiable or measurable, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, they created National Institute of Standards and Technology, that's NIST. So NIST created the NIST risk assessment. And here, we're still not using numbers, but at least we'll be able to put values into some risks. So how do they propose you to perform risk assessment? Well, basically, we're going to conduct assessment by identifying the threat. So it's the same idea as we saw before, but now you have to consider 4 different threats: adversarial, accidental, structural, and environmental. Adversarial, that is the most obvious one. That is the one that we actually think about when studying cybersecurity. So this is a situation where you have a very clear adversary, right? So for example, one country that is in war with another country, and so the governments are battling for information, for example, for technology. So one country actually wants to attack the other country, right? So that is a clear example of a adversarial threat. So observe, this is a clear presence of a adversarial threat. Does that mean that the risk is actually there? Does it mean that the risk is low, medium, or high? How do we measure that? So far, we're only trying to identify the existence or not of a threat. We also have accidental threats. That is the situation where just by accident something happened, right? So, for example, the network analyst performed a misconfiguration of something, or by mistake just purged an entire partition, or didn't monitor the UPS and the battery is not charged, and then the power goes down and those devices that are connected to that UPS also go down. So this is purely accidental, although it's very much related, it can be very much related to misconfiguration. We also have structural threats. So for example, if a system is getting overloaded, a router, for example, is getting overloaded, and then it's not being able to process all the data that is arriving and leaving that network, that organization network, then you're losing packets. Packets that are not supposed to pass are passing through in the network. So that type of situation, therefore, you have a structural threat. And we also have the environmental threats, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. For example, hurricane hits, earthquakes. Now, we also have to identify vulnerabilities according to the NIST risk assessment. And this just goes back to the previous slide where we determined what a vulnerability is. So, according to the infrastructure that we have, do we have vulnerabilities? Do we have failures in our systems or in our devices that are susceptible to attacks? So you have to identify those vulnerabilities. Now, based on that, you can determine likelihood of occurrence and the impact. So the likelihood of occurrence is directly related to the threat. So these threats actually exist. So you have adversarial, you have accidental, you have structural, and you have environmental threat. But what is the likelihood of these threats actually occurring? It all depends on the vulnerabilities that exist. So in order to be able to determine the impact, you have to identify the vulnerabilities. Combining threat and vulnerability, just as we saw over here, would give us the risk, right? But there is no measurement. In order to be able to measure that risk, we have to determine the likelihood of occurrence, or determine the threat and determine the impact of that vulnerability. Now, you use likelihood of occurrence and impact to determine the risk based on this matrix right here. So you have the likelihood being measured from low to medium to high, and the impact being measured to low to medium to high. And then you combine those in order to determine that. So, for example, let's say that there is a adversarial threat, right? And the a specific server has a vulnerability that would allow a adversary to cause a denial of service. So bring the web server down, for example, right? So what is the likelihood? Okay, do I have a very present adversary? Do I have someone, another organization that is actually trying to bring my server down? Yes. And what is that level? Low, medium, or high? Let's say that it's high. Okay, good. Now, that vulnerability, the vulnerability that is present in my web server, is it low, medium, or high? What is the impact? Well, the impact is high because if it's exploited, then my server will go down. So then we're going to have high likelihood with high impact. So the risk is going to be high. So that is how you should use the NIST risk assessment matrix. Again, even though you may not use this matrix, you have to be aware of it and how to analyze it, because you're going to see it in the CompTIA CYSA Plus exam.